And I had a chance to see during the Kuchma period how little attention was paid to information safety and its topicality. My example, I am a graduate of Kyiv Journalism School, and we had a military department there. What surprised me, it's quite natural that journalists could be war correspondents or people dealing with special propaganda techniques. But even back then, Ukrainian education system was preparing out of the journalists military psychologists. Back then, nobody thought that the military actions could have a different dimension, that they could be information military actions. There are a few countries in the world who work very effectively with propaganda, and this is Russia, this is China, and the United States of America. Americans are quite different here from China and Russia in their military propaganda. Any kind of effective propaganda cannot be a total lie. It's a balance of the truth and the lies. It's the percentage is about 80% of truth and 20% of lies. Another stereotype is a Nazi Goebbels medium 40 to 60, 40% of truth and 60 of lies. The example of how propaganda works is seen in Donbas. When Putin talked to Jewish communities in Russia, he said that Goebbels was a talented person. These were not empty words. They basically loaned the tools that Nazi propaganda worked with. And you can see it in how they create their content, both in Putin's newspapers, where the information is balanced. There are Ukrainian news there. About 20-30% of the information is objective, 70% is propaganda. And then during the war, the Nazis created a very effective campaign that worked in France, where the French in the occupied areas were convinced that this is a dissident radio station, that it is broadcast from London. The same percentage, 40 to 60, was preserved there, but it was an especially created German radio station which masked itself as a dissident station. Another example of working with, of fighting propaganda is an information strategy developed by the USA during the Reagan period. Back then, the USSR invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and there was a problem that a very socialist country had a very strong propaganda machine. Despite the opposition, like for example in Poland, the Catholic Church. However, in the Soviet Union, this war had great support in the society. So Ronald Reagan did a very simple thing to oppose it. It was called Crusade for Freedom, and he created a number of independent radio stations like Voice of America and others that already existed. Some of them were created from scratch. And then the distance those signals went to was to the farthest points in the Soviet Union. I myself spent my childhood in Crimea, and every evening with my father we sat down in front of radio and we listened to Voice of America and listened to the truth of what was happening in the Soviet Union. These are my recommendations. They are very simple. This needs to work practically. I totally support Harmash here. Radio has the biggest influence. It gives you anonymity. In Crimea, people have satellite antennas. When you look for certain content on the internet, your providers can leak the information. about you. However, radio is totally anonymous. I just returned from Washington, where I had meetings in the U.S. Department of State with the deputies of head of the U.S. Department of State and other leaders there. It was a coincidence that last week the Congress approved a program of counteracting Russian propaganda. So there is such a program in the United States, and we need to start such work in Ukraine, because Ukraine is the main target of this aggression, and it needs to have its own program. Thank you very much. A lot of us have started such work in Ukraine without waiting for the United States. Mariana, 5 minutes for you. I only want to add something about independent media. Our research shows that Ukrainian society demands such media today, and this can be proved. For example, we had this study in Kharkiv. There is a very low credibility of this media. People do not trust it. People need a source they could trust. On the other hand, people don't differ much in the East or West. The share of people who cannot think independently and critically is about the same in both cities, and they need independent information. There is also an issue of resistance to propaganda. In Lviv, it's easier because there is a certain information policy, there is a certain conducive environment, and it influences the results. As to Kharkiv, there is a high share of people resistant to propaganda. Yet, the people who don't think on their own is a great number. These are potentially people susceptible to propaganda. So it depends on who takes up the airspace. In Kharkiv, people, for example, don't discuss information. And the people who are susceptible to propaganda, on the other hand, they share the information and disseminate it among other people. The problem is that the situation can get worse if other organizations don't take it as a problem. Did you research how ready the Ukrainian population in occupied territories is to perceive Ukrainian propaganda? We have not done such a research yet, but we can do it in our next project. Thank you very much. We have heard what information policy Ukraine has in Donbas. Now, very briefly, in 1 or 2 sentences, what do you think the information policy should be in Donbas? You mentioned this partially. However, briefly, can you formulate your ideas? We start with Denis.
So what should Ukraine's information policy be like in the Donbas? And then prepare your questions, please. Ukraine should implement such information policy that will be clear and understandable to the local population in the Donbas. What do I mean? Everything that comes from the Ministry of Information Policy or some central TV channels is perceived as propaganda by the local population. So we need to apply a different approach, and we can learn from Russia. There are a lot of good examples there. For example, expert Shari. It's not written there that he writes for the Russian government. He's basically a Ukrainian journalist, but he works for the Russian government. So we need to create our own Sharian. We do not need to create something Ukrainian in the Ukrainian language, because the local population will perceive such content skeptically. We need to find such an approach to people, like Carnegie said. When you go fishing, you do not take strawberries with you, but worms. So if we do it that way, then the situation will be completely different. We do not need to implement direct propaganda. We can spread some doubts. Well, I think that the subjectivity of occupied territories is beyond the occupied territories themselves. So I think that we need to focus on the continental part of Ukraine. And what is important, and this is something that I want to point out, that first of all, we need to outline the prospects of Ukrainian occupied territories, the European prospects for the Ukrainian occupied territories, because we have some experience of that. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just very briefly, brief statements. Mr. Berezovets, you're welcome. Well, I'm completely convinced that we should not try to convince people who not really see themselves as part of the European Ukraine. It will be vain efforts and resources. I think that the best arguments for those people that are hesitant or that are in doubt in the Donbas and in the Crimea, the best argument for them to be more loyal towards Ukraine is successful Europe-oriented Ukraine as part of the European Union and NATO. If this is the prospect that we draw for them, if Ukraine manages to fulfill itself as a member of the European Union, that will be the best and the most powerful argument for those people in the Donbas and in the Crimea. Mr. Harmash, you're welcome. I think that for the majority of people in the Donbas, and 70% of them have never left their region, the successful European experience of Ukraine will not be a powerful argument. I think we need to think about what happens when the war ends. As a result, we will have a region that hates Ukraine, and Ukraine that hates the region for their sons having died there. So I think that now we need to focus more on the need for propaganda. And I'm not afraid of this word, because propaganda can be about a healthy lifestyle, can be about European values. We need to focus on systematic efforts because Ukraine should be ready to take responsibility for the war in the Donbas, and the Donbas should be ready to take on the responsibility for the future of Ukraine. When we have this mutual responsibility, when we have this mutual repentance, then this feeling, this sentiment will unite us, and we will not try to fight for superiority. So we've heard 4 different opinions, and now it's time for questions. 2 questions at a time, and then answers. You're welcome. Oleg Berezuk, Samopomich faction in the parliament. I would like to hear the opinion of Serhiy, Denis, and Taras, the analytical representatives of the fourth estate. The best counter-propaganda is the complicated answers to questions. It's clear what to do in the long term, but what should we do in the short term? Should we isolate these territories, or maybe we should announce local elections on the occupied territories as proposed by some European politicians? So what should Ukraine's short-term policy be in the Donbas as an answer to the question, what should we do now? Thank you very much. And the next question, Roman Zygovsky. My question is to Taras Berezovets and Serhiy Kostynsky. Nowadays, in Ukraine, there's a daily publication, Vesti, that is distributed in the number of 350,000 copies in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Odessa, the hot places, basically. So what should our response be to such a publication? Because this publication is about anti-Ukrainian propaganda. Can you illustrate one specific example of anti-Ukrainian propaganda from the Vesti newspaper? Well, give me at least one copy of this newspaper, and I will find scores of anti-Ukrainian propaganda examples there. Well, you've made a very powerful statement, but we all know that journalists need to support and reinforce their statements by arguments. So I'm not trying to deny your questions. I just want to give more boundaries to your question. I will try to give an answer to the question from a representative of the Samopomich faction. I think that there's a very simple recipe for what Ukraine should do now for the restoration of information presence on the occupied territories. First of all, we need to find those speakers and journalists that will be heard and perceived by the local population. In Kyiv, we have a small community of immigrants from the occupied territories. These are basically Russian journalists that are not needed by either state or private mass media organizations. I met with Maria Stroeva from TRK. She is trying to find a job right now. She is very reputed in the Russian Federation, and she, with her Russian accent, would be of great benefit if we created an independent media for the Donbass or for the Crimea. In the first row, we have Arkady Babchenko, a famous Russian journalist. He has hundreds of thousands of followers in social networks, and a major part of the Russian liberal community looks up to him. I'm not sure whether Arkady Babchenko would agree to something like that, but I think people like Arkady Babchenko and Maria Stroeva could be the voice of truth on the occupied territories, and believe me, the trust towards them would be much higher than towards me or some other Ukrainian journalists. I think that Ukraine's strategy should be very aggressive and offensive, because Russia had a lot of opportunities to spread its propaganda, but basically the boundaries of the occupied territories are the limits of the Russian propaganda. Of course, the Russian propaganda works in Kharkiv region, in Zaporizhia region, in Odessa region, but I know some entrepreneurs from those regions, and they say that after the certain events, the history took a turn. So no one is thinking of creating Odessa People's Republic or Kharkiv People's Republic. I think that we should also close down certain Russian mass media if they violate the Ukrainian legislation. It might not be very democratic, but if they violate our legislation, we should do that. Well, I think that you cannot close down anything if you do not have any specific criteria for that that are fixed at legislative level. That's why the expert committee at the Ministry of Information Policy is developing the information safety concept for Ukraine, and we also need to have a response from civil society. First of all, we need to have commonly recognized and legitimate methodologies for the research of the hate speech used by the Ukrainian media. We need to have specific criteria to be able to say that this Ukrainian publication, for example, uses the hate speech. And we also need to implement a discourse analysis. Recently, I was present at the defense of a thesis on discourse analysis, and I really hope that we will be able to implement this methodology into our work. I have a short comment with regards to Kharkiv, but please introduce yourself. I'm from Kharkiv. We have Russia-oriented editors, but we do not discuss these topics because we do not want to argue, so it's a matter of tolerance. And I have a question to Serhiy Kostynsky. Any project starts with the research of the psychological portrait of your target audience? Do you travel to the Donbas? Do you try to understand the mental picture of the local population there? Thank you. And Serhiy Harmash will answer the previous question while other people are preparing. With regards to the Vesti newspaper, I do not think that we need to close it, but I think that we need to create equal conditions, equally competitive conditions for all Ukrainian media. We should not have any free distribution, and people will not be ready to buy the content of this newspaper. As for the strategy towards the Donbas, I'm also a coordinator of the coalition of patriotic forces of the Donbas. It's a unity of over 20 organizations and civil society institutions from the Donbas, and we developed our strategy, our concept. I submitted it to Hanna Hopko and some other MPs from the Samopomich faction, and I think that we need to ensure the maximum possible liberalization of private people. We want people to come and buy sausage and see that it's 3 times cheaper with us. And we do not block anything, but I think that we should see that there is a complete economic isolation and political degradation and social degradation, because those territories are basically controlled by Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. And when Sobolev said that they are preparing a draft law to legitimize food provisions, I think it's a very wrong strategy, because when you have a drug addict, you can provide this person with drugs, but they will not solve the problem. So maybe we should let these people get over their disease on their own. Наталя Курдякова, Харків Crisis Media Center. We often go to the front line, and we know from the horse's mouth the real situation, not only on the occupied territories, but also on the liberated territories. It's clear that with regards to the occupied territories, we need to do some work there, and we need to spread Ukrainian information there. But what about liberated territories? Some parts of Luhansk region, there is only Luhansk 24 and Россия TV channels, no other Ukrainian channels. Based on our experience of communicating with soldiers and the local population, Stanitsa has a great head of the district administration who says, I'm ready to dance and mimic in front of these grannies, but when they go back to their homes and watch television, I cannot really convince anyone. I cannot really prove anything. And what about values? It's true indeed that the 2 towers that you implemented are not efficient. Do you work with the local people and with the local journalists that can offer some ideas? We are planning to install a big number of towers along the boundary of the conflict zone, and the fact that we have installed 2 towers is already significant. I cannot, what else can I tell you? I cannot tell you that this is the only thing I can do, but believe me, it's very difficult to bring into Ukraine some of the transmitters that we received from Poland, for example. We do not have the necessary legislation to do it quickly. So what else can we do for now? Offer some ideas. We're ready to meet you halfway. And conceptually, what about the work with people on liberated territories, not only in terms of transmitters and towers? As for working with people on liberated, not occupied, but on liberated territories, first of all, we need to provide them with access to the Ukrainian mass media. They need to be able to watch Ukrainian television and listen to the Ukrainian radio. This is the first thing that needs to be done. We have dedicated advisors on the Donbas, and these advisors coordinate information activities on the liberated and occupied territories. Thank you, Serhiy. I think that it's good to provide the local population with access to the Ukrainian mass media, but I think we need to start with trying to work better, because if we provide them with access, they will just see the situation of 2 or 3 years ago. Let's do not view the government the way they do it in Russia. The government is not a bike. It's more about go ahead and do it. This is basically the main slogan of Lviv, and it's a big task of people from business and civil society. I was delegated with this task by the local civil society and business environment. So offer your ideas. We're ready to support you. I also know that the Ministry of Information Policy does quite a lot to make sure that there will be Ukrainian radio in the Donbas and on the liberated and occupied territories. 2 more questions and it'll be the end of this discussion. My name is Romana Drejko. I'm the director of Channel 24 and Radio 24. With regards to what the Ministry of Information Policy does and does not do, on the one hand, the Ministry does quite a lot. The Ministry produces a lot of statements about their work and a lot of reports on what they have done. And they talk a lot about their plans, about the launch of new channels, the foreign language channels that were supposed to have been launched a few months ago, or a channel for military people. But this is the extent of their work. So what else does the ministry do apart from empty statements and empty words? I wanted to show a short video clip about what the local population of the occupied territories see, but also the residents of the liberated territories see the same picture. So I just want to illustrate the picture that they see there. Do not explain anything, because if you want to show something, show it. But I want to comment. They say that it makes their brains boil, basically. Something that one person asked about after this speech by Bernard-Henri Lévy. We're already trying to compete for who has done more, or who is going to do more for the benefit of the country. I think that the absence of the answer is sometimes the best answer. Taras, you're welcome. I have a short comment. I'm fully convinced, and if you ask this question, I'm sure that if you ask the question whether the state can be an effective owner of media, I think everyone will agree that the answer is no. It's obvious. So I think that we need to count on private initiative, and this is something that we can see based on channel 24. You produce very good content. It's a good example of how we can combat the Russian propaganda. My dear colleague and citizen fellow Serhiy Kostynsky referred to the slogan of Lviv, "Go ahead and do it yourself." We are grateful to the Canadian government because thanks to them, we initiated the project Free Crimea. We actively use the Russian social network, in particular Vkontakte, where we disseminate information, and we have numerous followers there. We disseminate information about the events in the Crimea. On the Chornomorka channel, we have a program, Free Crimea. This program is broadcast in the Russian language, and you can find this program on YouTube, and we have already received some preliminary results. We have got some orders, and we produce content based on the orders. Now we have a number of orders for our souvenir products, and we receive these orders from Krasnodarsky Krai, from Novosibirsk, and from the Crimea. So even there are people who are in favor of Ukraine. We just need to disseminate information to them. I keep looking back at the topic of our discussion. What is Ukraine's information policy in the Donbas? And my conclusion is there is no information policy as such, because it's great to install some transmitters and towers. It's great. But it's just a tool. It's just one of the mechanisms. But the question is, what are you going to transmit? What kind of content you're going to transmit using these towers and transmitters? And of course, the Ministry of Information Policy cannot give any instructions or lay down any laws. The ministry should be just a coordination unit. We can sit down together and elaborate a common strategy that will not be mandatory for everyone, but at least we will have a good understanding of the fact that it will be perceived and supported by the majority of Ukraine. I think that the Ministry of Information Policy does do quite a lot. But most of the things are not done, not because of the ministry, but because of the government. I do not see general interest of the government in uniform information policy on the occupied territories. I do not see any efforts to implement the policy of reconciliation within Ukraine, between the Donbas and other regions of Ukraine. So I think it's a matter of some deeper problems at governmental level. Denis Kazansky, your summary statements. In fact, I think that if we want to implement any sort of information policy, towards those people that live on the occupied territories does not really make sense now, because I don't think that they will return to Ukraine. So I think that we need to target those regions that are still part of Ukraine and that are in the risk zone. Odessa, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia. And if we want to implement any sort of meaningful information policy there, we need to unite our efforts. We need to set up a creative platform. And this is something that journalists can do. This is something that volunteers can do. But the most important thing is that everything we do in these regions should not be just silly propaganda. We should implement raising awareness efforts. There are some destructive statements and myths that Russia uses against Ukraine, and we need to work with these destructive statements. I think that we need to particularly work with the pro-Russian people, and we need to debate with them because I think their advantage is that they are not really allowed on air. They are not really invited into television programs, and that's why they are free to express any opinions that they wish in their areas of residence. So I think that we need to involve them, we need to invite them, and we need to debate with them around those statements that can trigger more hatred, that can trigger more conflict and hostile attitude. And the last comment by Mariana. I just want to add that, in my opinion, it's of utmost importance to raise awareness and to launch educational campaigns in different parts of Ukraine. Once again, I want to cite figures from Kharkiv. When we were testing the receptivity to the Russian propaganda, we found out that about 30% of people cannot really formulate their position. They're not sure whether they agree or disagree with the Russian propaganda. What happens with these people? 1.5 years of the Russian propaganda in the Ukrainian information space, and these people are still hesitant. They're not sure whether they will be convinced by the Russian propaganda or no. So we need to work with these people as well. Thank you very much. Big gratitude to all the participants of the discussion. I think that we all have become witnesses of the implementation of Lviv slogan, "Go ahead and do it yourself." And the director of Channel 24 has done something himself. He prepared a short video clip and shown it to us. So I think this is something that we need to continue doing. So do it ourselves. So thank you to all the participants of the discussion.